Well, good afternoon and welcome to Round the Table with Christian Concern. I'm delighted this week to be welcoming two special guests, but in particular, we have got Dr. Lisa Nolland joining us to talk about the subject of sex education, what could possibly go wrong. Thank you for joining us, Lisa. And we've also got Steve Beegoo here, who is our head of education at Christian Concern as well. Thanks, Steve. Great to see you.
Good to see you.
So, Lisa, tell us, how do you describe yourself? It's a sex historian, is it, that you describe yourself?
Yes, indeed. Yes.
What does that mean? Tell us, because I've not met any other sex historians before.
I'm not surprised. I and my organization track sexual culture, what's going on at the many different levels, and particularly we are most concerned about how this is landing with our children.
Right. And so, and how long have you been doing this, Lisa?
About 40 years.
40 years. Wow, that's a long time. Just for those watching and listening live, if you're on YouTube or Facebook, just we can see your comments. If you've got questions and queries or comments, do let us know and say hi there, and we can say hi. I see we've got viewers from Sussex and Glasgow already on the stream here. So, Lisa, sex education is a topic today, right? One you're very familiar with. When did we first start having sex education, and why was that?
From what I understand, it first came into play in a big way in the 90s.
Right.
And there were several reasons for that. You have the pill in the 60s. You have abortion in the 60s. You have gay rights in the 80s. You have secularism. So basically what's happening is you have diseases that youngsters are connecting with, and also pregnancy. So those are two of the main push.
But before the 1990s, there wasn't really any sex education in schools.
Yeah, there was some, and some schools, I've seen some examples are awful, but no, there wasn't a huge push from what my understanding.
It's just a sort of biology lesson.
Yeah, that's right. And many parents are put on the back foot because they remember when they were young, the birds and the bees, etc. No. We're on another planet now for many children. So that's a really important aspect I think we need to know. It's not, for the most part, it's not the same as adults remember being taught.
Okay, so let me just explore that a bit more. So I remember a sex education lesson when I was about, 13, maybe in a biology lesson, and that was about it. Maybe one other lesson as well, and that was about it. So what's it like now then, Lisa?
It all depends, but some of the stuff we have seen is simply atrocious. It is OMG. You're teaching this to 4, 5, 6-year-olds. They're becoming comfortable with their body, with their sexuality, etc. And in terms of older children, it's even more explicit. But then some schools are still okay. That's part of the problem here, is there is no uniform answer from what I know. Steve, maybe you have a different experience.
Yeah, I think a lot of schools are trying their very best to deliver suitable education to their children. But what we're seeing is there's an age inappropriateness to it, which you were just highlighting about. It's going younger and younger and younger. And essentially because these issues, there are so many issues prevalent in society that we've allowed to come into society, that in order to protect children, the answer, of course, what's the savior of the universe? It's education. This is what will save us. This is what will rescue us. So let's make sure we tell all our children about the things that are going on in the world and educate them by just informing them about them outside of moral frameworks, or actually within a specific sort of moral framework, which is the kind of the liberal agendas that we're seeing today. And schools are trying to navigate all of this and do it as well as they possibly can. But what we're seeing is there are some ideological pressures upon our schools, which are allowing things which many of us, especially Christian parents, would say are inappropriate. Is that right, Lisa?
Oh, very much so, very much so. But also, just simply for the record, I'm totally for excellent sex education. And that's why I'm so appalled at some of what I see, because it omits key bits of information. It doesn't even tell kids exactly what they are getting themselves into. But also it is literally sexualizing them. It is modeling, it's grooming them to explore their sexuality long before they're ready in terms of mental and moral and even physical development. May I share one of the worst stories I've come across like 2 weeks ago? Is that okay, Tim?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. A mother came in touch with me. I've been talking about one of the reasons I'm so worried about this LGBT stuff for children in primary is it eroticizes same-sex friendships. And I didn't know what she would make of my concerns. I don't know where this mother is at in terms of morality or religion, whatever. She got back to me and said, I totally agree with you, Lisa. My daughter, who's 8.5, is now saying she's bisexual. She is very much loving her best friend, who's a little girl. She's wanting to grow up, have a family, have a house with her girlfriend. She's wondering how lesbians make babies. See, this is at 8, you should be able to love your same sex girlfriend, boyfriend with no erotic overtones. See, we really are eroticizing child development. That's what's so scary. So, children who don't want to be thought of as gay are withdrawing from vital same sex affectionate relationships. They need this. When I was 8, I loved my best friend, and I never once thought I was gay. I didn't want to explore her orifices, her openings. See, that's how bad it is in places, not everywhere.
What about Section 28, Lisa? And that came in, when was that? In the 1980s, to protect children, wasn't it? And say you're not allowed to advocate some pretended family situation. Can you just talk about that, and then the abolition of Section 28 and what difference that made?
Well, the Margaret Thatcher wanted, given the Stonewall situation in the U.S., from my understanding, so there was a push. So gays and lesbians were very much coming out as adults, and Thatcher realized, no, we don't want to do this in terms of youngsters, particularly children in schools. And we don't want to have them start even thinking about issues that they are not ready to engage with properly. So Section 28 was put in. Now, many people, there's all sorts of, pros and cons, whatever, but definitely, so it got chucked by a more progressive agenda. I don't know how many years later. Now, would I want Section 28? Actually, what I want is no sex ed for children, particularly in primary school. Just lay it off. We want children to have a happy, healthy growing up experience without sex because they're not ready for it yet. And pushing it is, in my view, a form of child abuse.
And what we have at the moment is the government are saying it's not required for primary school children to have sex education, but a lot of it's been left to schools to decide what they do. And a lot of schools, under pressure from sometimes lobbyists, under pressure from sometimes parents or their own staff, are saying, well, we want to do sex education with our primary school. And some of the decisions that are being made are deeply disturbing parents, deeply disturbing some of those teachers when they do not have to be delivering sex education. Now, there are some very wise things to be talking to some of the older primary end about, but what we're seeing is a completely another end of the scale, as Lisa has highlighted.
And the only protests we're seeing about this are actually, it seems, from Muslims. Is that right?
And in fact, yes. In fact, Muslims ask me, where are the Christian parents? Don't they know that their kids are going gay? And I say, God bless those Muslim parents, because they know, hold on, this is distorting my child's development. This is nuking my child's development. So they wonder, what has happened to the Christian parents? And I say, I don't know. I don't know.
What do you say, Steve?
Yeah, I think parents have got the biggest influence over children. And what I think about Christian parents is that a lot of us as Christian parents are not really taking on board our responsibility to pass on our Christian faith to our children. And we're leaving all the training and teaching to others. And as some wise person said recently to me, if you send your children to Caesar, don't be surprised when they come back home as Romans. And that, sadly, is the kind of situation that we're often finding ourselves in as Christian parents, sometimes through ignorance. Somebody said to me it was laziness on the behalf of Christian churches and parents. I think it's as much to do with busyness. We're so rushing around doing other things that we forget, hang on, my children are being taught 30 hours a week in a certain setting. And what is it they are being taught? Because nowadays they're being taught a whole worldview, from a whole worldview perspective that isn't from a Christian worldview perspective, about identity, about sexuality, about everything. And we kind of backed away from our God-given responsibility as parents to teach our children about what's going on inside us when we have feelings. And are we created? Yes. Are we fallen? Yes. And to talk these kinds of issues with our children as parents, because we're the best people to understand what is appropriate for the age that our children are. It's not, when you've got a class of 30 children, trust me, I know, I've been there, but you've got 30 children as a teacher, trying to reach all of them appropriately is not going to be straightforward, and particularly around such sensitive and key issues as sexuality.
Could I come in there? I think this Muslim Christian parent issue is very important in terms of it shows how Muslim parents, as they realize the toxicity in the general culture, and they're appalled. See, in many ways, our Christian parents are so identifying with their culture that they just don't see it. Or if they do, it's, oh, well, it's a little problem, it's not much. Whereas you see, your Muslim parents understand, hold on, this is huge and pernicious. And therefore, if we don't stand up to do something, well, we will lose our kids. But the Muslim parents say to me, we're concerned about Christian children too. They're concerned about children, full stop. They don't want children damaged. And I totally agree. That for me is the big thing. It's not what religion you are. This is damaging child development for many kids, like this little 8.5-year-old who's happily doing LGBT artwork at school, etc. And she's 8.5.
Yeah.
We're not talking about being negative about people from different family backgrounds, or not being kind, or not understanding that people have different issues and different feelings. This is about what is appropriate to teach small children and young children particularly, because they can't understand the concepts. They're being introduced things that are, as Lisa put it, eroticizing everything, referencing everything from a sexual perspective. And referencing everything from a sexual perspective to children and young people has damaging effects.
Huge.
Lisa, can you expand? Because you say you're not against sex education, full stop. But so what's good and what's bad about sex education?
Okay. Right. I believe, if at all possible, parents need to be the ones, starting from tiny, in age-appropriate ways, to be encouraging children to be proud and of their bodies, to be respectful of others. Others may have different views, that's fine, but this is how we see things, etc. So parents need to be on the front foot. And if they can't, then they hold hands with other parents, maybe with bring in groups like Lovewise. They do a great job. So definitely we are for good, accurate sex education. But my problem is you have these lobbyists and advocacy groups that pump tons of money in to curriculum, which is simply saying, use a condom, get the jab, explore your sexuality safely, and have fun. Now that is as appalling as it could be, because children and young people are not adults. Their prefrontal cortex is not developed. They don't
Right.
understand risks. They don't understand. So many of them are concrete thinkers. I love my same-sex best friend, therefore I'm gay. See, that's how they see. They're not thinking at a higher level, so they're not able to evaluate risks, etc. Miriam Grossman, sorry, maybe if someone could put up her book, fabulous book, Miriam Grossman, MD, You're Teaching My Child What? Question mark. And she talks about the differences in terms of age stage formation and what's appropriate and what isn't. So yes, we're definitely for good sex ed. Lovewise does a good job in terms of these issues, but what so many adults, they're either lazy, they're trusting the system, they don't want to know, they keep remembering their own sex ed and think it's not a problem, whatever. But I would just beg them, please wake up, smell the coffee. Things have changed. It's not necessarily what you got. In fact, it could be the total opposite. And yet they still trust the system. So perhaps that would be my first recommendation. Stop trusting the system. Your children are your children. You're the ones that will see them from when they're tiny through to when they get married, have their own babies, etc. You've got to be less dependent on the system, the establishment, and take control over. You're the mother, you're the father. That's a big deal. And that includes education and training.
So I can see a comment here from somebody called, is it Colkhead on YouTube, saying this all starts in nursery now. I was chatting with my granddaughter last summer, then 3 years old. Out of the blue, she said, I'm going to marry a girl. Who told you that? Nursery school.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
That's not even really sex education. That's kind of promoting an ideology about what marriage is and what kind of relationships you can expect to have, isn't it?
Correct.
Really there.
Correct.
Yeah. So, Steve, where are we at in terms of RSE, as it's now called, isn't it? Relationships and sex education? Because
before I get into that, one of the things I would say is what we're finding is that a lot of Christian parents are recognizing they can't trust, as Lisa was saying, they can't actually trust the system. They can't actually trust the local school and the local place, which is an extremely sad state of affairs. Many are trying to make a difference and get on governing boards and get involved in the consultation that there was on RSE, and to say, well, this isn't appropriate, is it? And I would like my children to be taught in line with my own religious convictions, which is the law, which is the Human Rights Act allows that. So a lot of Christians are actually taking their children out and home educating. A lot of Christians are joining independent Christian schools, some of the newer ones that I've got a lot of connections with, to try and find places that will genuinely support the Christian upbringing of their children. Because, I mean, coming on to RSE, RSE has just become this summer term mandatory in schools. So relationships education in primary schools, not sex, but a lot of them are doing sex education, but relationships, sex and health education in secondary schools. And there was a mandatory consultation that all parents should have been able to have been involved in. If you don't feel you know what your children are being taught in RSE, you should do, because you should have been consulted.
What you're saying is the school, not the government, the school has to consult with its parents about the content of RSE. Is that primary and secondary schools?
Yes, so they have to consult about the policy that they're delivering, and any changes to that policy also have to be consulted about. And as part of that, they should be discussing with you and revealing to you transparently the curriculum that will be taught. And sadly, we've had a lot of people connecting with us saying, I am now discovering what it is that my children in secondary and primary are going to be taught, and I'm really disturbed. How do I handle that? And we've been, from Christian Concern, we've been helping, and Roger Kisker in the legal department, helping all sorts of people to try to manage their communications and processes so that they're respectful and polite, but so that they're saying, I'm not happy about this. I don't want this going on for my children, and to be able to speak up.
Steve, what would you say to Lisa Pritchard on Facebook here, who says the schools won't consult? We email consistently and get told nothing.
Well, you should say back to the school what the law is and what the guidance states, because they should consult. And I've written an article on our Christian Concern website about how to raise your voice effectively to the school, because there's various things that you can do as a parent to raise your voice so that you are heard. There's various scaling up of things if you need to do that. Hopefully, and the vast majority of heads and teachers, and we've had some really good experiences where parents have raised issues with schools, and the head teacher's gone, look, I'm really sorry, I hadn't realised that actually this was such a big issue. I hadn't even realised the kind of curriculum that we were using. Can you believe that? So actually, by pushing back, you can have good conversations, and you can be really helping the school understand what they should and should not be doing, because they've been lobbied by all sorts of organisations. And they haven't necessarily had the time, given all the difficult issues that schools have got to process with the pandemic. They haven't necessarily processed this very well. But you may need to scale things up. And for some situations, again, Tim, you'll know some of the cases that we're dealing with. We're actually going the legal route to support parents where they're really having to push back strongly against ideologically driven head teachers and deputy heads and even multi-academy trusts who are trying to push some dangerous and harmful material onto young children and engaging them in this kind of sexualized.
So just another question here from Jerome Lloyd on Facebook. If they don't consult, can they press on with the curriculum regardless?
Well, schools will press on with their curriculum. If nobody's raising an issue, they'll just crack on and do whatever they like, unless somebody is raising the issue and somebody is making a point. Even you can't even trust Ofsted necessarily to go in and say, hang on a minute, you shouldn't be teaching this stuff, because Ofsted themselves have got quite an ideologically driven mandate. It very much depends on the inspectors. You can have some fantastic inspectors, but again, some of the issues that we've been picking up on have been of some faith-based schools where they just get pummeled for not teaching one particular sort of thing. And that one particular sort of thing in the personal development aspect is the LGBT side of things. Where that isn't even required in a primary school. So you can't necessarily just think, well, they've got inspectors, they'll check out and make sure that the kids are learning the right kind of stuff. No, you as a parent are the primary person, and you need to raise your voice with your school in as effective way as you can. Again, it doesn't have to be combative, it can be very supportive, but there might come a stage where you have to say, no, I've got to push back more strongly. And organisations like us at Christian Concern, we can help and support you, especially if it gets.
What about, there's a few questions here about differences in England and Wales and Scotland. Steve, are you able to comment on that?
A little bit. So again, I think the main thing is there are differences around the country, but the gatekeeper in every school is the head teacher, and pretty much all of the sectors of UK society, what they're saying is we're leaving this to the schools to decide really what happens on the ground. So whether in Wales they have sexuality education now, and you can just hear in the terminology itself what is going to be happening in those lessons. Scotland has been profoundly open to having named persons, for example, who have a higher priority than parents. Thankfully, that was pushed back against, and we haven't headed in that direction. But again, the Scottish Nationalist Party have a very liberal attitude towards these kinds of issues. But again, it's the head teacher. These are the places. This is the gatekeeper, the main gatekeeper of a school, and the governments will basically say, "Well, talk to the school about it. We're giving them this guidance, and now the school is deciding what is done and what isn't done." And still, we have some case law on the kinds of things that we're pushing back on from parents or even from teachers sometimes, or chaplains. Until we get some case law, we don't really know what's going to be decided. We pray and we hope, and please support Christian Concern. I mean, it's a big challenge to face down through the legal system some of these issues that we're facing down. Please pray for us, support us financially in different ways, so that we can get some case law, so we can push back wherever we are in the United Kingdom on the kinds of issues that are being pushed. Lisa.
Yeah, okay, just two things. One, in terms of Scotland, the best pushback, parental power pushback I know of, is the Scottish Family Party with Richard Lucas. He's amazing. He goes through the entire curriculum. They do a really good job. So Richard Lucas, the Scottish Family Party in Scotland. In Wales, we are working, my organization is working with some very brave mums, particularly, who are pushing back. In Wales, it is now mandatory. You can't even remove your child. It's worse. Wales seems to be the nadir of all this. So thank God for this group that is pushing back. But again, where is the church? Where is the church? Sadly.
So, Lisa, so we've also been in the news in the last few months, this whole thing about everyone's invited, the whole rape culture and sexual abuse culture, and all these people putting up their testimonies, their stories of abuse of different kinds in schools. And it started off in public schools, in private schools, and then it's spread into other schools as well, hasn't it? Now, how does this relate to sex education? Is the answer more sex education? How do you think it relates to this, Lisa?
Okay, it's as if we have a fire and our politically correct progressives go, oh, we've got a fire. We need to dampen the fire. And so they put gasoline on the fire. More graphic, explicit sex education simply models the many different ways you can have a sexual release. Again, children are not teens. Teens are not adults. This level of advice might be okay for adults. Maybe not. I'm more open to that. But certainly for youngsters, see, it just prepares them. It grooms them. Miriam Grossman has a phrase that I think she uses in her books. Children are like wet cement. Whatever falls on them makes an imprint. See, it sticks. You don't teach children about something. You teach them something. Like one of your listeners said her 3-year-old granddaughter talked about marrying her little girlfriend when she grew up. See, you don't teach about, you teach. So I'm not at all surprised that we have a completely crazy situation. And the answer is no, not more graphic sex education, in my view. Steve?
Yeah, society has moved in a certain direction, which has allowed pornography to proliferate. Yeah. We put technology in the hands of every child, on which there's this infinite internet playground with all sorts of pornographic content. You got 35%, I think the last statistic I wrote, 35% of 15-year-old boys access daily pornography. Even in the church, I mean, that the issues around looking at pornography from men in the church is extremely high. None of us are protected this. We've allowed this in society, and society's answer is to kind of educate and inform in order to protect. Rather than just protecting them from this stuff, we're going to tell them what they need to do to protect themselves as a young child or a teenager. And in the telling them about all of these things, the ones that haven't touched it yet get woken up to all of this, all these issues, the sexuality, the sexualization gets stirred up in them. So they start to think about these issues. The confusion arises because they're not prepared, as Dr. Lisa has accurately explained about brain development. They're not prepared to understand these issues and the link of their feelings and sexual conduct. Why should they be thinking about those things at those younger ages? And then that perpetuates then society increasingly becoming more greater amounts of pornography. So there's this vicious cycle and circle, and it's, does anyone protect children anymore? Do we believe in innocence of children anymore? No, the answer is, the savior is education. We just tell them about, because by telling them about, you're not teaching them anything. Well, that's rubbish. Just like Dr. Lisa said, you're telling them about something, you're teaching it to them. And you always teach it from a particular worldview perspective. Yeah. You can't just say that education is a neutral thing. Whoever is teaching it to you is passing on the values that they have about that thing. And so we see a vicious cycle of a continued and increasing sexualization through the media, through the laws even, and even through schools and education.
So, Lisa, what can we do about this? How do we respond then as parents and churches and maybe teachers as well in schools to this whole agenda?
Well, perhaps 5 things come to mind. First, individuals. If you're a mom or a dad, I would encourage you to buddy with someone and start to pray regularly for your youngsters, because they're experiencing a very different world from what you and I experienced growing up. So you start to buddy and you go from the back foot to the front foot. You realize, hold on, it's not the same. As Dorothy says to Toto, we're not in Kansas anymore. See, many parents still don't get it. And that's a huge part of the problem.
Yeah.
We're not in Kansas anymore. So one, you start to buddy, and you number two, you start to think differently about it. You start to educate yourself. So Christian Concern does great stuff. Parentpower.family, they do great stuff. You bring experts to address your little group of parents, your church, whatever. You start to get your head around what's going on here. Number three, well, I do sex proofing kids. So I will tell you all the reasons why this stuff is so damaging. And to be honest, I never use God, because I find with God, if you talk about God with a youngster, they go, oh dear, there's the morality again. See, smart kids right now realize smoking is really bad for them. It damages them, if not sooner, then later. It's the very same thing with sex. Sex damages. If not sooner, then later. And so basically, smart parents can tell their kids, hold on, don't do this yet, because you'll pay. And I want you to have the best adult life. Don't do it now. Press pause. So resources, LoveWise is another really good resource. But fourth, in terms of what the church can do, the church has got to stand up and take ownership here. They've been missing in action and asleep at the wheel. They've assumed things are fine while they run their internal church programs. Folks, they're not fine. Increasingly, our youngsters are just, once you start exploring your sexuality, guess where Bible studies on Mark go? It becomes irrelevant. So the church has got to step up to the plate here and engage. And finally, political parties. Some political parties are more open to our concerns than others. But essentially, the church and Christians have got to realize we've got to engage, because we are losing our children.
Steve, anything more you'd add to that? That's a very good list, Lisa.
I think there's a foundational concept of where we get our identity from, which is also absolutely key to understand, because the society around the world around says you get your identity from inside of here. This is how I know who I am. It's because of my feelings. And my feelings are really who I am. And unless I can express my feelings, whatever they are, then I am being repressed. And I'm unable to fulfill my identity and my potential. Whereas there's a different story, and it's the Christian narrative. And that is that we have been created by God. We've been created, and yet we are fallen. And so we can't trust our feelings, but we can trust our Heavenly Father to discover who we are and our identity. And that's something that we can be teaching our children from very young ages, that there's a creator. They're not just an accident. They're not just a product of some random process of evolution. God has created them, and he's created them with purpose. And yet we are messed up and we're fallen, and we need God's help so that we can restrain and self-control some of the feelings that we have, not just have to express whatever feelings we have in order to be something. Actually, we already are something, because we're created and loved by God, who wants to help us and come alongside us and rescue us. And this narrative, which points to Jesus Christ as the one who rescues us and who will give us an eternal life with wonderful, perfect relationships forever, and wants us to start to experience that now in life, you invite them into this story from a young age, and then they can be protected from the lies of society around. But if they're constantly being told the other story and living in the other story from the media, from the school, from their peers, we can't expect them to live out of an identity that comes from an understanding that's biblical. And that's kind of an even deeper and more fundamental layer and level that, as the church and as parents and as schools, we should be focusing on.
Yeah, that's great. Very, very helpful. Lisa, I wondered if you'd like to expand on the point about how it damages you, because viewers might not be familiar with all the points that you would make on that.
Okay, and this is also complicated, and sorry, it's generalizations, but certainly in younger years, we don't want them, because they are concrete thinkers, we don't want them either exploring their sexuality, their oral, anal, or vaginal orifices. That's what some SRE does. It literally encourages children to explore these bits of their body.
right.
No, we don't want that. My line in terms of that is, they're beautiful, they're wonderful, press pause, grow up first. So not a focus on your orifices. And that is what we have with some sex ed. So we say, no, it's wonderful, but now get back to what your tasks at hand are, to grow up. So it damages healthy child development for younger years. I have already talked about how kids can think they're gay because they love their same-sex best friend. No, I loved my same-sex best friend. You both loved your same-sex best friend. No, it's not part of being gay. It's part of how to grow up into healthy heterosexuality. So for younger children, it can damage them that way. For older children, basically from 11, 12, whatever, and up, sexual activity comes with a huge price tag that almost no one wants to go to. Your, quote, mainstream sexual health sites totally, either they minimize it or they ignore it altogether. So some of the research that has been done for sexually active youngsters indicates, and I just wrote this down, so I'm glad you asked me, lower rates of self-esteem, associated risks, that is. So lower rates of self-esteem, they regret the sex, there's depression, there's suicide ideation, sexual exploitation, dating violence, and rape. That's just general. Now, if I may, can I say a story in terms of all this? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Tim? Okay. I was at a debate. It was just awful because I came thinking we're going to talk about this, and we talked about that instead. There was this little 20-something-year-old who's watching as the debater and I were going back and forth. And at the end, I thought, this has been a disaster. He gets up, walks away. She turns to me and says, I actually agreed with quite a bit of what you said. And I went, really? You're kidding. She said, one of my friends has herpes. It's been an absolute nightmare. The rest of us cannot find any chap to simply have a normal relationship with. Like, where are they? What's happened? They are all into exploring their sexuality. See, that's how it lands for average kids who want to simply find someone, marry, whatever, and do life together. That's how it damages youngsters. And that is one of my main problems. Kids aren't being told. They're not being told, look, you're playing with fire and you could get burnt. So if adults want to play with fire when this bit of their brain is totally developed, it's their choice. But youngsters are not adults. So, and there are many other biological, anatomical things I could mention. I won't. But it's damaging. Kids do not need this. It puts pressure on them. And that's why I'm saying, don't do it now. Grow up and then decide.
That's helpful.
And there's a whole aspect of being immature. When you're mature, you can deal with the consequences of your actions. Yeah. Whereas children and young people, actually the parents often end up dealing with the consequences of the actions. And there's a whole layer of separating children from parents in all of this, where children are being seen as they kind of units of society, autonomous individuals. Yeah. And a good friend of mine said, we need to get back to talking about sons and daughters, about our sons and our daughters, not just children, because they're just seen as like these units of the state. Let's talk about them as boys and girls, sons and daughters, with a gender, and talk about them in reference to them having parents, which is where their primary place of protection and identity and discovery and teaching should come from. And I think that whole layer of encouraging children, our sons and daughters, into things that they're not able to handle the consequences of, that is an essential bit. And when you're an adult, you decide to have sex when you're 18, well, then you'll need to deal with the consequences of pregnancy and how you handle all of that. But when you're 14, 13 years old, no.
It also damages your ability to form long-term relationships, doesn't it?
Exactly.
I think that's a very important one to teach and explain to people. What you really want, what you're going to be very satisfied with, is a long-term relationship as an adult. And if you explore and play around with sex as a young person, it damages your ability to have that. And that's quite a serious point to make. Lisa, how do people connect with you and your organization if they want to sort of go further into this?
Yeah, sure. Okay, my email, Dr. Lisa, DRLISA 1957 at gmail.com, or my website is msc.support. But email me is probably the best.
Okay, great. And your organization, do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, Marriage, Sex, and Culture Group. We work with anyone who is looking at the revolution that is descending upon us and going, it is cultural Marxism is what it is really, and wanting to not only be a, or so our members are both appalled but want to push back. And one of the main places we push back is with the RSE. So we want the best for our kids, and what they're being given now is not the best. So I work with many people who are not Christians. Actually, in many ways, not yet Christians get it far better, because people in the church, I don't know what the problem is, but I work with Muslims, with others of other faiths, and no faith, but they see what's going on and it's not okay, and they're pushing back.
Great. Well, listen, that's been a really helpful conversation and great insights, I think, from both of you there. Thank you so much for joining us, Lisa. Really appreciate your time and your expertise and what you're doing to watch out in the culture and resist and encourage other people to resist what's happening in the culture. It's really valuable work. So do connect with what she's doing if that's interesting to you. And thank you all for joining us and watching today. And do connect with us. Follow us on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter, and sign up for our emails on our website. And we'll look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you very much. Goodbye.